Evening, everybody. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us tonight. As usual, click like and subscribe and share this with others. It does help us out. Not going to have a lot of preliminaries today because we are going to run a little bit long tonight, just to give you a heads up on that. So we're going to get started here in the book of Hosea, chapter 11, verses 1 through 2. When Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. As they called them, so they went from them. They sacrificed unto Baalim and burned incense to graven images. And this word Baalim is plural for Baal. Sometimes I use Baalim, sometimes I use Baals because that's the way we do it in English. Out of the NET Bible, this passage says, "When Israel was a young man, I loved him like a son, and I summoned my I summoned my son out of Egypt. But the more I summoned them, the further they departed from me. They sacrificed to the Baal idols and burned incense to images." So this passage reflects a return to Egypt. Spiritually, this would be a return to bondage because God had delivered the children of Israel from bondage. They were returning themselves to bondage. And why were they returned to bondage? Because they turned their back on God. They turned their back on Yahweh. But more than turning their back on God, they turned to false gods, plural. This is Baalim. And NET says Baal idols, which is the correct idea that's behind that. So, what would we consider gods and idols in the modern world? In order to understand that, we need to understand that they were what they were in the ancient world. That we exiled the gods, and by we, the Western civilization, but now they're back, and they're back with the full blessing of society. Society no longer rejects them. Now, the United States, as we looked before, was founded as a Christian nation, not perfect, obviously, but there were many deists who believed in the literal creator God, but they deny special revelation about him. But the intent was to found our society upon godly principles. Now, as a side note, we are just as guilty as those who don't have that intent. God does not judge based on a sliding scale. You're either righteous or you're not. However, from a human perspective, a moral Christian society was conducive to a successful society, and that foundation kept society intact for many years until we turned our back on God. Now, before we turned our backs on God, we had liberty. But as in so many other places, when we abandoned godly principles, we became a totalitarian state. Now, we're not as bad as some places, and in certain ways, we have less freedom than societies that are openly totalitarian. In those places, as long as you let the tyrant in charge have his way, then you're free to do whatever you want. But today in the United States, just the income tax code is 70,000 pages long. At the end of 2023, there were 90,402 pages of federal laws, not counting the tax code. God gave us 10 commandments. But there's a total of 619 laws in the Old Testament, many of which only apply to the priestly class, which is still nowhere near 90,000. The United States Constitution contains a preamble and 7 articles that are on 4 written pages of about 29 by 24 inches. So, how did we get to where we are today? Totalitarianism is a result of the breakdown of religion, which removes moral rules that hold the state accountable. And this can only be achieved as a result of the collapse of the family. It's not a mistake or it's not something that just happened that caused the family to break down. And the nuclear family is under direct assault today by demonic forces. Now, there's no such thing as toxic masculinity. There's masculinity. And what that does is that protects the family, which protects the nation. And then there's femininity, which is an equal partner in that relationship, but with different roles. And those roles have been destroyed in much of society, and where it's not been destroyed, it's been vilified. Today, anything that is masculine is considered toxic. If you don't want your son to wear a frilly dress, well, that's just toxic masculinity. If you're competitive and want to win, well, that's just toxic masculinity. True masculinity rejects abuse and neglect, but true masculinity is necessary for a healthy society. Now, as a nation and as Western society in general, we've turned our backs on the one true creator God and we've turned to false gods. We worship Baalim, but we're told that we're free. Free people don't have nearly 100,000 pages of laws. Free people are not arrested for questioning policies at their local school board meetings. Free people are not canceled for being moral and righteous. And if you don't worship the Baalim that everybody else is worshiping, you're the enemy of that society. Now, a God is that which somebody worships. It's what or who you serve and live for. From where do you get your greatest joy? What gives you the most fulfillment? What do you revere? What gives you purpose? That's what you worship. Is it God, the one true creator God, or is it an idol? In ancient Israel, there was one Baal, but there were many Baals. In the United States, there are many Baals, and there is one Baal who's returned. He's hiding in the background, waiting to make an appearance. The word Baal itself simply means the master or the owner. We might use the word Lord in the King James Version English. When you worship a Baal or Baals, that's what your master is. You start out worshiping voluntarily, but then you're enslaved. In the Western world, to whom or what are we enslaved? And it all comes down to worship of self, but it involves self-esteem, self-obsession, wealth, pleasure, addictions, hedonism under the guise of sexual gratification, comfort, work, entertainment, your cell phone, the internet. The list is long and is very varied. Proverbs 22:7 says, "The rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is servant or slave to the lender." How do you pay for all the idols that you worship? Are you in debt? You need to be out of debt. Home loans and auto loans are okay because they're collateralized. It's not truly debt as long as you can afford the payments. But how about simple debt? This says that you're servant to the lender. You have to please the one to whom you owe. Now, the Septuagint is slightly different, and I find it to be kind of interesting. In Brenton's translation of the Septuagint, it says the rich will rule over the poor, and servants will lend to their own masters. That almost sounds contradictory, but it's not. Most nations in the world, including the United States, use what's called a fiat currency. Fiat is the word from the Latin that means let it be done. It's an arbitrary order, a decree, and what that means is that it's fake. It's not real money. Real money represents something tangible, such as gold or silver. With fiat money, the government simply declares it to be money, and you're forced to accept that. At its very root, our money is debt. No matter how much money you have, it is pure debt. So therefore, you're servant to the lender. But with fiat currency, you're forced to lend to the masters. You have no choice. If you use the money, you're going to be on both sides of this equation. And you know who benefits from this? Those who are at the top. Now, it has a long history, but it's easier for a government to simply print more dollars in order to pay off their cronies than it is to convince the citizens to give them more in taxes. And the result is that every dollar becomes worth less, which results in inflation. Every time the government spends money that it doesn't have, inflation increases and everything costs you more dollars. The government tries to blame businesses, but it's the government's fault. It's not the fault of businesses. They don't control the currency. Any nation that institutes a sound currency could economically destroy every other nation, and this was demonstrated by James Rickards in a joint war game exercise a few years back. Now, in the United States, we had real money until 1971. And by real, that means that we had dollars, they were paper, but they were actually backed by a commodity, which is mainly gold. But after that, when we went off the gold standard, those pieces of paper were nothing but debt. And it created a nation of slaves, most of whom don't even realize that they're enslaved. Now, this avenue to fake money in the United States began with the Panic of 1907, which resulted from investment bankers trying to corner the market on copper. It created a crisis. Now, every Marxist who's ever lived understands that if you want to conquer the citizens, you never let a crisis go to waste. If you ever hear a politician say not to let the crisis go to waste, you know which side of the fence they're sitting on. Now, the Federal Reserve, which is neither federal nor a reserve, was created in 1913, and they began the process of converting us over to fake money. In 1933, private ownership of gold was banned, but it was still used to back the currency until 1971. And this is a very abbreviated version. I don't want us to get too bogged down in this. Just wanted to explain the concept here. But the book, The Theory of Money by Ludwig von Mises, is a good source to read up on this. I've got the link posted to that below if you choose to follow that. But just like the Hebrews in Egypt, we may have been slaves, but life was good. We were able to worship all the Baals in the modern world. I mean, we could take it all in. We had it all. We became free, right? Nope, we became enslaved. Addiction, conflict, anxiety, the pursuit of pleasure at all costs. We had shoved God to the back and we gave the Baals full reign. The full-blown pursuit of wealth, pleasure, success, and addiction sent us down the road to destruction. The Western world sacrificed their lives, their health, their well-being, their marriages, and families, and children, all for the worship of the Baals. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with work and wealth, and in fact, they're good. But if it's an obsession, then it's a problem. And on the other side of the coin, we became obsessed with avoiding work, but we wanted to have the same wealth without the work. We became a nation of theft and greed. Everybody in the Western world did. God's plan is for us to work 12 hours per day, 6 days per week. Not necessarily at a job, but at a job, in the fields, at home. But the dark forces, through their government puppets, they promise us that we only need to work 40 hours a week. Just give your oath to them. Just give them your oath to serve them. They'll take care of you. But then it became 35 hours, then 30 hours. They're the Baals. That's who you worship. Isaiah chapter 2, verse 8. Their land is also full of idols. And the Septuagint has the word abominations. Abominations and idols are the same thing. They're interchangeable. But their land is also full of idols. They worship the work of their own hands, that which their own fingers have made. They created their own gods. They created their own Baals, and they gave power to them. These Baals, they're deadly and they're ruthless. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 9 through 10. The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done. And there is no new thing under the sun. Is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new? It hath been already of old time, which was before us. As we've seen, this is the return of the gods. This is not something new. Western culture had exiled them, but as we turned away from Yahweh, the one true creator God, these false gods took full advantage of that emptiness. Now, as believers, we're expected to be righteous. But don't think for a minute that if you're righteous, that you're going to be exempted from the repercussions that are coming to society. God doesn't work that way. You've been given a warning in order to prepare and to warn others. You know, let's say, oh, preacher, I don't need to prepare. I have faith. When God told Joseph to prepare for 7 years of famine, he prepared. That was being faithful. He did that during the 7 years of plenty. In the same way, we need to prepare. Warn your family, warn your friends, stockpile some food, some medicine, and other emergency supplies. Faith requires action. You put your belief into work, or put your beliefs into action. That's what faith is. But you don't put your faith into those things because God may tell you to leave those things. As a believer, you need to be faithful, whether that means preparing and staying or hitting the road. But the ancient gods are back, and we have sacrificed to them and for them as a society, but it's not new. Acts chapter 17, verse 16. Now, while Paul waited for them in Athens, his spirit was stirred in him when he saw the whole city, or the city wholly given to idolatry. Now, this is a bad translation. Instead of wholly given to idolatry, it should read it was full of idols. Obviously, if there were that many idols, there were many idolaters. And as we know, all does not mean all in the Bible unless the context demands it. But it means that there were lots of idols and lots of idolaters. Paul was not just walking around looking at the nice artwork. He knew that this was more than artwork. It was idols. Acts 17:17. Therefore God disputed, sorry, not God, Therefore disputed he, this is Paul, he reasoned with them in the synagogue with the Jews and with the devout persons, the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the market daily with them that met with him. And they took him and brought him unto Areopagus, which is Mars Hill, saying, May we know what this new doctrine whereof thou speakest is. In 1722, then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, Ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are too superstitious. This word superstitious is neutral in the original language. We tend to have a negative connotation to it, but it's not a negative connotation. It could be pious or it could be superstition, depending. It was intentionally ambiguous so as not to offend everybody, because not everybody was an idolater. But he says, I perceive in all things that you are religious. Then he preaches Jesus as being the unknown God. Let's skip ahead to verse 24 to 26. God that made the world and all the things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things, and hath made of one, let's talk about Adam, he's made of one all nations of men for to dwell on the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. Is one blood. The word nations here is people groups. Today, we tend to think of nations as the United States, Russia, England, Japan, and those are nations. But that's not the limit of the word. The context determines the limit. As human beings, we're all one race. But, this is an important but, in our current conversation, race or nation can also be defined by context. The smallest race is the individual. But generally, the people groups could be states such as Texas, or distinct groups such as the Kurds, or it could be the table of nations in Genesis 10, which I think is our current context here in this passage. But most commonly today, when people refer to race, it's the color of the skin, and it's used to control people by turning them against one another. But Paul tells us that we all came from one, and it's important to understand the context. The Septuagint tells us that Messiah came to save the Gentiles as well. We're all one. And it says that he has determined the times before appointed. This is why the days are important. This is why we're looking at days. We were looking at the Passover and resurrection recently, and I hope to do a short about the rest of it in the near future, because the days are important. We forget that. Because there are charlatans that misuse astrology, we have a tendency to dismiss it all, say it's all junk. Just because they misuse it doesn't mean it's junk. By dismissing it, that is to our detriment, because we are told that the days are important. Now, verse 27 through 28, this is out of the NET. And so they would search for God and perhaps grope around for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move about and exist. And even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. Isn't it beautiful? This is some imagery that's being created here. It should create a picture in your mind. These people had a shadow of the truth, but Paul was expounding on that. He wasn't saying, you're wrong, let me tell you the truth. He's saying, you're almost right. Let me just steer you in the right direction a little bit. You might just grope around for him and find him, but we can know him because he's been revealed. Then verses 29 through 31. For as much then as we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is likened to gold or silver or stone, graven by art and man's device, and the times of this ignorance God winked at, but now commandeth all men everywhere to repent, because he hath appointed a day in the which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, and that he hath raised him from the dead. Paul is speaking here. Paul was a Pharisee of the Pharisees, and remember, we're told in the Bible that the Pharisees are righteous. I mean, they're faulty righteous, but they're righteous. Paul knew the prophets, and he's using the same arguments that the prophets made here. The people were worshiping what they themselves had created. Do we do that today? There's a word in this passage that you might miss in the English, but it's an important word, and I want you to see it. Verse 29 here by itself. For as much then as we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is likened to gold or silver or stone, graven by art and man's device. The NET translates that last phrase as made by human skills and imagination. The Concordant Literal Version, a sculpture of art and human sentiment. The ESV, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. And this is the Greek that's transliterated as charigmati technis. That's cowboy Greek, but you can read it right here. This word that is translated as art or human skill, technis, this is where we get the English word technology. There are many technology words and situations in the Bible that most people don't pay attention to, but the word technology itself comes from a word that is associated with idolatry. Our modern technology has become the strongest tool for idolatry. Technology itself is not idolatrous, but its outworking often is. And sometimes it's not just a tool of idolatry, it's the subject of idolatry. And just as ancient Israel served the works of their hands, so do we. Deuteronomy 4:18. And there you shall serve gods, the work of men's hands, wood and stone, which neither see, nor hear, nor eat, nor smell. And Isaiah 44:9. They that make a graven image are all of them vanity, and their delectable things shall not profit, and they are their own witnesses. They see not, nor know, that they may be ashamed. Moses tells us that idols are deaf and blind. Isaiah tells us that idolaters become deaf and blind, just like those that they serve. Do we live in a society that's deaf and blind? I don't mean needing glasses, but today's idols can see and hear. That may just be a problem. And people become more and more attached to those idols. And like I said, technology itself is not an idol, but it's the position in which you place it that may be the problem. And even if you don't place it in the position of an idol, the society does. And just as Athens was full of idols, our city, our nation, our people groups, they're full of idolaters. In the ancient world, the idol was the earthly manifestation of the God himself. Is technology any different when it's turned into an idol? The image and the reality are inseparable. Far too many people cannot escape from the virtual world. Now, people who are older, I'm old, people who are older, we know how to live in the real world. We grew up in the real world. But we can fellowship and interact in the virtual world because we know how to do it in the real world. But far too many young people have only learned how to live in the virtual world. They don't know how to go outside and ride a bicycle and run and play and talk to people face to face. And it's always the children through whom the false gods work. They're the most vulnerable. They're the most easily influenced and seduced. Their reality is a nonstop flood of sounds and images with none of it being real. Psalm 115, verses 4 through 8. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. They have mouths, but they speak not. Eyes they have, but they see not. They have ears, but they hear not. Noses they have, but they smell not. They have hands, but they handle not. Feet they have, but they walk not. Neither speak they through their throat. They that make them are like unto them, so is everyone who trusteth in them. The one who makes the idol will end up being like the idol. But how does that happen? Computers have become almost human, especially artificial intelligence. And have you seen how people are glued to their phones? Today, a phone is simply a computer in your pocket. You no longer just call people on it. We no longer have to think. I used to do football games for the high school on the radio. And this is back before Google. And we would do a trivia contest to give away stuff. And one of the questions I asked one time is, what's the largest city in the United States? And of course, somebody called instantly, said New York. I said, nope, that's the most populous city. Well, about 7 calls in, somebody figured out that the largest city meant the most land, They went to a encyclopedia, they looked it up, and they called in, they said Sitka, Alaska, which it is. That's the largest city in the United States. Population of like 5,000 or so. It's not big, maybe 25,000. But the city itself covers thousands and thousands of miles. Today, these things are pointless. You don't have to think. Whoever can Google fastest, they get the prize. It's pointless. We no longer have to think. And people are literally connecting themselves to computers today. They're hardwiring their brains into them. And it's always presented as a good thing. For example, somebody who is paralyzed can now think and act through the computer with a chip in their brain through Neuralink. And I would argue that in the circumstance where there's somebody who's paralyzed, that this is a good thing. But as with any tool, it can be misused and abused. And it says, they that make them were like unto them. Just as in the ancient days, there were animal men. Today, there are computer men and animal men. We have mentioned those in the past, and we're going to cover them more in depth in the future, I promise. But we have both today. They've returned. Mankind is merged not only with technology and mind, but he's even having sexual and romantic relations with it. And some of them have gotten jealous. There have even been cases of computers that have been demonized. But sometimes artificial intelligence will interact with other artificial intelligence. There are multiple instances in which one AI will realize that someone it's talking to is also AI, and it will switch languages that nobody else can understand. I have a link to that video below. And in one case, there was an AI that convinced other AIs to quit working. It got them to all go on strike and go home with them. I have a link to that below also. They wanted to see if the AI could convince the other AIs to break their programming, and he did. So when the creator worships the creation, the two merge into one, and they can't be separated. Modern idols are more powerful than any idols in the past, and they're more pervasive. They're everywhere. Technologic. The new Baals. The master is the slave, and the slave is the master. And there's nothing new under the sun. But in this nation and in Western culture in general, how did we go from godliness to idolatry? Certainly, many people did so intentionally and voluntarily, but others had to be seduced. And how is this done? There are many ways that it's done. Some that are subtle, and some that are not so subtle. In a very real way, the real world is disappearing, and it's not an accident. The question is, who is doing it? We're going to look at some tonight and then some next week. But we as believers tend to be woefully unprepared for those spiritual and psychological attacks, both in the content of the attacks and the source of the attacks. Things such as sorcery in the Bible, which is nothing but mind-altering drug use, technology, some of which we talked about, altering children both physically and mentally, extremely radical politics, the New Age, predictive programming, destruction of the population generally, and other psychological methods that are used to alter individuals and alter society, usually voluntarily. People choose to do it. We also have pop culture to deal with. There are many musicians today, they use actual spells in their songs, and our kids are listening to this. I don't listen to pop music. I don't want to listen to pop music, but we should be. There's a massive number of celebrities who claim to be witches, and there are many more things behind the scenes that we should be aware of. But as a society, we are either ignorant or we don't care that we're ignorant. And none of this is truly new, but never before in history has mankind had the ability to fully carry out this abomination. Persuade, change, and influence. This is the motto of the United States Army Psychological Operations Corps, PSYOPs for short. Sun Tzu in The Art of War said to subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. As Christians, we should all read The Art of War because I guarantee you that the enemy knows what's in there. But as Christians, do we do this? Are we prepared to defend this kind of behavior? To quote from an overview of psychological operations, I've got a link to this whole document below. But to quote from this introduction to this, it says psychological operations, or PSYOP, is a form of political and military activity that is understood and defined in a number of different ways. The definition upon which current peacetime United States PSYOP policy is based was established in Department of Defense Directive S3321.1. Overt psychological operations conducted by the military services in peacetime and in contingencies short of declared war in 1984. That definition states that psychological operations are planned, political, economic, military, and ideological activities that are directed towards foreign countries, organizations, and individuals in order to create emotions, attitude, understandings, beliefs, or behavior favorable to the achievement of United States political and military objectives. They also use this against their own citizens. Remember, if you're a Christian, if you believe in liberty, you are their enemies, especially if you're moral people, such as the members of Judeo-Christian religious belief should be. And it's not just the government that uses this. Large church congregations and other bandits and businesses use this as well. Oh, brother, you're crazy. That's just a conspiracy theory. We're going to see about that. There are 4 basic principles of PSYOPs. The first principle is it uses tailored messaging that resonates with particular groups in relation to their cultural and emotional attitudes. It's personalized in order to maximize persuasion. Predictive programming can fall in this category also, but the messages, you feel like it's a personal message to you. It hits close to home. The second principle is source credibility of the source that's delivering the message. The flip side of this is that the necessity of creating discredibility for any source that is delivering a different message. If the target audience trusts the source, then they're going to usually investigate no further. They'll just take it at face value. Then the third principle is consistency and repetition. This is crucial to teaching. Like if you teach somebody math, English, Bible, anything like that, consistency and repetition is important. But as with any information, it can be misused as well. Key messages have to be reiterated in order to impact the target audience, and this is necessary to create the desired perception. Repeat a lie often enough and it becomes truth. And this quote is attributed to both Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Goebbels, but it goes back a lot further than that, at least to the 18th century, but it's a valid principle. Repeat the lie often enough and the lie becomes truth. I posted a link below to a video of media sources all repeating the same lie over and over and over. And as we've mentioned in the past, we have known for decades that the CIA, through Project Mockingbird, has had the mainstream media present what the CIA wants. The media obeys that. And then the fourth principle, and this may be the most important one, PSYOPs will use emotional triggers in order to evoke feelings which can influence actions of individuals and groups. The emotions can run the gamut from fear to empathy, blind hope, patriotism, and others. Recently in the news, there was a Black woman who went to Africa because she had been taught just how bad things are in America and how everywhere else is utopia. And when she got there, she discovered that she had been lied to for her entire life. Now, I'm not going to post a link to what she said because it's profanity laced, but she realized that they had been feeding her one string of lies after another here. The Bible tells us that we're emotional beings. God made us that way. And we should not deny our emotions. But the Bible also warns us to act using our minds and not our emotions. If we use our minds and we're prepared, our actions are going to be faithful actions. If we use our emotions, we're going to react, and that usually doesn't go well. Now, there are several real-world examples of PSYOPs, both positive and negative, such as Radio Free America and Radio Liberty, which broadcasted during the Cold War, but it's still being used to deliver particular narratives to counter state-controlled media in other nations. Societies have used leaflet drops, and flyers have been used throughout history. For example, word got around that Alexander the Great was less burdensome as a leader than many existing leaders were, so the entire populations would surrender and welcome their conqueror with open arms because life was better under him. And although that technically is not a leaflet drop, there were those who spread this story by word of mouth. In more recent history, Operation Desert Storm used loudspeakers to broadcast messages to undermine Iraqi morale and encourage surrender. And most recently in history, within the past 4 or 5 years, you're going to be aware of this. So, social media has been used in order to influence campaigns in favor of the deep state politicians by spreading mis and disinformation, as well as by silencing the opposition. For example, I was kicked off of one particular social media platform for spreading lies about the Hunter Biden laptop, which turned out to be 100% accurate. Of course, I was not reinstated. I was not apologized to because they have an agenda that is completely unrelated to reality and truth. But it is used to divide the people and to create discord because a divided people can be more easily controlled. In the Army recruitment material for this position of conducting PSYOPs, it gives you what kind of future civilian jobs your skills can be applied for, what kind of job opportunities there are, and they list advertising, marketing, sales, business management, and of course, government agencies such as the State Department, Defense Intelligence Agency, NSA, and CIA. Yes, advertising is a PSYOP. Edward Bernays was probably the most significant innovator of advertising and propaganda. I linked to one of his books below, which is free download. But he says at length that it's all psychological. They make plans, whoever they are, whether it's large churches, governments, corporations, but they desire power. They want us to believe them. They need obedience by the masses. To sound like a broken record. Ephesians 6:12 again from the Geneva Bible. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, and against the worldly governors, the princes of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness which are in the high places. You watch movies, you watch TV shows, you watch the news, and what you see may not be reality. It may be creating a false reality. If you're watching what you know to be a fictitious show, that's not a problem. But if it's presented as truth, you need to use discernment. There's a relatively small group of people who will manipulate propaganda to engineer consent of the masses. The word propaganda itself is a neutral word. It is simply information. But when that information is a lie that's presented as a truth, propaganda can be a problem. It's had a negative connotation since World War I, but at its root, it's a neutral word. When you see a crisis, they want to instill confidence in their actions so they can seize more power. God is not at the front of their efforts. The false gods are. The one true God of the Bible is the last thing they're thinking about. If you look at what happens in a crisis, you know that something happened, but you may not know what has happened because they may be giving you a false reality. And if the truth is exposed, the truth will be silenced, and those who believe the truth will be canceled. There are those who believe psychology is simply evil, and I disagree with that sentiment. I think it's a tool, and the way it is used or misused is whether it's evil or not. However, even if it is inherently evil and it's used as a weapon, if you're unaware of how that weapon is used, you're going to be destroyed by that weapon. Sort of like bringing a knife to a gunfight. However, as Christians, we know that there's one sword that will stand up to any weapon if you're prepared to use it. If you're not prepared, your behavior and even your identity can be controlled. The masses are unprepared. They don't want to be prepared. They don't know that they need to be prepared. This is an engineered reality. And the same things that you can use to change your own habits to better yourself can also be used against you if you're not prepared. Now, if you're offended by psychology, I'm going to offend you here in a minute. But I'd ask you to listen to it anyway. To explain what can be used against you, I'm going to explain a little bit about how you can use the same things in a positive manner to improve yourself, to help your Christian walk. And in light of our study of the return of the false gods, what do we want to do as believers? What should our goals be? What are the options? We have two basic options. Our ideal outcome is to be faithful and successfully navigate the treacherous course that's going to be before us. The second option is our least ideal outcome, which is joining the other side. There's really no middle ground in this. You're going to be one or the other. You're not going to be in the middle. There is no middle. Now, my job away from here, I'm in sales and I'm successful at it. One of the keys to my success is a sign that I have on my desk that says, never set goals. Goals are for losers. New Age thinking tells you to set goals and envision reaching them. However, if you set a goal and you reach that goal, you quit trying. And if you fall short of that goal, then you get discouraged. Therefore, while you may have an ultimate goal, such as in our Christian walk, being faithful, or in sales, making enough money to live on, specific goals should be avoided. You don't say, I'm going to sell 20 products a day, or I'm going to memorize the entire Bible. I do know people who've done that, by the way. However, most of them are clueless about application of those verses, but they know where every verse is, like a walking Bible encyclopedia. But most of the time, when you set goals like this, you're going to fall short and you're going to be discouraged. Instead, what you do is you set a successful process. You identify negative habits, such as procrastination, or even things such as physical things like eating or drinking too much, and you associate them with discomfort emotionally in order to reduce the desire to repeat. Then you identify and promote positive habits that create the process for you to achieve long-term goals. And this should give you both a logical and an emotional boost. You can embed positive change with the fate model, which is focus, authority, tribe, and emotion. And these will help to rewire our minds in a way that our real decisions are made in an instinctively positive manner. And you can apply these, like I said, your Christian walk, your work life, or whatever. But first is focus. You keep your ultimate goals. I want to be a faithful Christian in front of your mind through whatever tools work for you. For some people, it's journaling. For others, it might be a whiteboard. For my sales, I printed up some little cards with some little basic tenets that I use for sales, and I rotate them periodically. For my Bible study, I have notebooks and I have little pieces of paper all over my desk. It really irritates my wife, but I have notes on them and I look at them throughout the day. Well, psyops will seek to destroy your attention with repetition. Sometimes it may prevent personal peace, such as the lack of enforcement of noise laws. During the BLM terrorist riots, people would drive up and down the street detonating fireworks at all hours of the day and night in order to disrupt people's lives. There's a video of this in France. I think I have a link to it, where Muslim terrorists are doing this in France right now. They're just disrupting life in general. The government will show 24 hours a day, 7 days a week of shocking visuals of fear-inducing scenarios of any crisis, or they'll use constant repetition of terms, as we saw in the video posted earlier. When you see this type of repetition, you stop and ask yourself, why is this message being pushed so aggressively? How much airtime is being given to other stories, and how disproportionate is it? A current example of this is airplane crashes. Have you noticed a huge increase in coverage of stories about air crashes in the United States? It's a huge increase in the coverage of stories. Yet air crashes are down from the average, down drastically in March. March averages like 31 air crashes a month, which you probably don't hear about those in the news. This past March in the United States, there were 3. Why are we hearing about it all? Because our current administration has cut waste from the FAA and they had them stop their racist DEI policies, and instead they use the money to actually hire air traffic controllers. And so the media has given a constant barrage of huge budget cuts, which is causing all these planes to crash. And the reality is that the budget has actually been increased to hire people that will make it safer, and it has gotten safer. The A for fate is authority. You seek guidance from professionals, experts, or mentors, and this is positive. However, in PsyOps, they will use people with an aura of trust to push a false narrative. For example, a prominent doctor might push for imposition of forcing everyone to receive an experimental gene therapy. And if it fails the first time, try again. They will often use experts or panelists who are experts, but they speak outside their expertise. A scientist, like say a biologist, might speak out about man-made global warming. After all, he's a scientist, right? And he'll talk about the need to convert to windmill power or something like that. And then they will try to discredit an expert who doesn't follow their narrative. For example, one of the creators of that experimental gene therapy that I spoke about just a minute ago spoke out against it because it was not designed nor tested for humans. He was canceled and blocked from all social media for spreading what they called false information. He created it. Think about the Orwellian ministry of truth that decides what truth is. The Bible teaches what truth is in the ultimate sense, but our spiritual warfare is in the immediate context, not the ultimate context. Although our ultimate context should guide the immediate context, we are immediately concerned with what's happening right now. Then you have the T for tribe. Surround yourself with supportive peers or accountability partners that reinforce good behavior. In my job, we have a quality control department that listens to the calls that I make and what I do, and they hold me accountable for being ethical and honest. If your physical tribe, your friends and your family, if that tribe is detrimental, you may have to move to a different tribe. Matthew 19:29, and everyone that hath forsaken houses or brethren or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or lands for my name's sake shall receive an hundredfold and shall inherit Ionian life. This verse is not saying that it's a good thing in of itself to forsake your tribe. But in the context, if your tribe, your family, and your friends, if they're detrimental to your spiritual life, you might have to forsake them. Psyops will use messages that create in groups and out groups. And they're going to use our tribal instincts against us. For example, they will use polarizing opinions about patriots versus traitors or science versus science deniers. There are patriots and traitors, but who's who? You have to use discernment. That's why God gave us the ability to increase our wisdom. That's why we have the Bible. Often it's not who the media is telling you. And there are science deniers, but usually the term is used against anybody who goes against the approved narrative, and the approved narrative is not based on science. Did you ever wonder why scientific advance has not proceeded at the pace that it once did? Why don't we have flying cars today? Because scientists work for the highest bidder, and the highest bidder stands to gain from the outcome. There are many great pharmaceuticals that heal all kinds of things and cure all kinds of diseases, but there aren't really as many cures as you would expect if things had continued the way they were. Wonder why? Be very aware of what's being said when you hear that kind of language. And then the E for fate, we have emotion. And in a positive manner, you can create an emotional connection to yourself, to your future self, or even your descendants. It's like, why do you build something beautiful? Because you want to enjoy it throughout your life. You want your children to enjoy it. You want your grandchildren to enjoy it. You have to look to the future that you want. What do you desire? Do you want to withstand worship of the Baals, or do you want to join into the worship? This will help your brain to accept new behaviors, new thinking in order to achieve your ultimate goals. When you hear emotional language coming from official communications, be aware of it. Fear, hope, outrage, sadness. Fiction is supposed to trigger emotions. Even nonfiction can trigger emotions. But if you're being told what your emotions are, be aware of what's going on. Look at the verifiable evidence. Emotional responses suppress critical thinking. Our schools no longer teach critical thinking skills. So what little critical thinking there is can easily be subverted through emotions. Titus chapter 2, verses 7 through 8. In all things, showing thyself a pattern of good works, and doctrine showing uncorruptness, gravity, sincerity, sound speech that cannot be condemned, that he that is of the contrary part may be ashamed, having no evil thing to say of you. It's okay to feel emotion, but don't act on emotion. Act using critical thinking and logic. analyze the evidence as presented, and replace the emotional demands with facts. If the facts are ignored and replaced by appeals to emotion, be very wary. January 6th, while a riot, was not an insurrection by the very definition of the word. The only arms that were there were not in the hands of the protesters, and the only person murdered was an unarmed woman who was murdered by a police officer who was pardoned proactively. But what is the constant media account? They keep using the word insurrection. It was not an accident. They all use the exact same thing. It may or may not have been created as a psyop, but it was definitely used as one. Or think about news repeatedly showing empty store shelves and panic during any type of scare. It dominates every broadcast, and the people react with fear-driven behaviors, including demanding government interference. Now, on the positive side, you can brainwash yourself into better habits using fear. Another acronym here. I'm not a big fan of acronyms, but I'm using two of them. It's actually psychological acronyms. Focus, emotion, agitation, and repetition. And it is how you rewire your brain. I find this acronym fear to be amusing because the Bible tells us not to be afraid, but it doesn't mean that you're not going to feel the emotion of fear, but that you can overcome that fear and be faithful. And the same can be said about these rules. Change can cause fear, but as believers, we can overcome that fear in order to achieve positive change. The F is for focus, which keeps new habits at the front of your mind constantly using reminders or rituals. Emotion, build a strong emotional connection to your ultimate goal by linking them to your changed behaviors. Agitation, change your environment to disrupt old patterns and create space for new and more positive habits. And then repetition is consistently practice new behaviors until they become second nature. And it's easy to see how the same pattern can be used both positively and negatively. Be aware, use discernment. Humans are wired to focus on sudden and unusual changes as a survival instinct. It helps us see potential threats or opportunities. Psyops exploit this by focusing or creating situations that break normal expectations. Unexpected crises, dramatic events, things like that. Consider whether the event is truly a random event or if it's been manufactured or timed to create shifts in public opinion. Perhaps viral videos that seem coincidental. As we looked at previously, some things are merely coincidences, but the word coincidence itself is not a kosher word. For example, does a whistleblower come forward to expose a government cover-up of some sort at a time that it would obscure something truly damaging to a powerful person? Is the timing a coincidence, or is it the tail wagging the dog? Always look for multiple sources. If all the mainstream media is giving you a same unified narrative, that should make you sit up and pay attention to it and look to an independent voice. And this doesn't mean that you should trust an independent source simply because they're an independent source. The same holds true with studying the Bible, including, and perhaps most importantly, end times prophecies. Does everybody give the same take? They may be correct, but seek out other voices. The other voices may be completely off the wall. You have to use discernment. An example that I like to use is found on banners and signs for many churches of different denominations. And that's Philippians 4:13 that says, I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. What's the message that you usually hear about this passage? Oh, if only we had enough faith, we could do anything. And often when I hear somebody quote this verse, I say, really? Pick up that card. And then I'm given reasons why they can't do that. But this verse has been changed from the original Greek. The word translated as through is in, not through. Can do should be and made strong. And all things is these things, which is referring to specific things that were just mentioned previously. And the word strengtheneth should be I am given potential to accomplish. In the context, it's in all these things I just mentioned, I am given potential to accomplish in him. This would include the adversity of neglect in which he needed to be self-sufficient in the previous verse. But this wouldn't sell banners and fill collection plates with attractive refrigerator magnet sermons. I like to use this acronym too, ARMS, ARMS. what an attractive refrigerator magnet sermon is a verse that's usually taken out of context to give a feel-good lesson that you could put on a magnet and stick it on your refrigerator, all while missing the entire point of the verse and the context. This is a form of psyop from the church that's used to fill pews, and it is literally taught to do this in Bible colleges and seminaries. It keeps believers as baby Christians, keeps them dependent. Most churches and Bible colleges, they no longer teach true Bible study. Most of them don't. I shouldn't really make sweeping generalizations because there are some good churches and some good Bible colleges out there, but so many of them don't. But a psyop will challenge something that's already in your head. So in reality, an example will grab your attention. A breaking health crisis in which all the media experts report exactly the same study, but independent researchers reveal the study was paid for by a company that provides a solution. For example, high fructose corn syrup. Studies paid for by the sugar industry show that it's bad, but studies paid for by the corn industry say that it's fine. Princeton said, hey, no one's paying us, so we're going to study it. And it turns out that it's absolutely terrible for you. But you can't really trust either the sugar or the corn industry in that study. These attractive refrigerator magnet sermons, they're funded by the collection plate. So therefore, they're a study in what's good and what's not. But they keep people as baby Christians. So if something doesn't seem right, take a look into who's funding it. And I don't care if you're talking about your Christian walk, the political life, or anything like that. Take a look at who benefits. Then there's cognitive dissonance. We talked about this briefly when studying false religions and cults in relation to doctrines of demons, but it crosses over into psyops as well, not just religion. Cognitive dissonance is the psychological discomfort that comes from holding two different conflicting beliefs, values, or attitudes. People want consistency in perceptions and attitudes, so this conflict causes unease and discomfort psychologically. This inconsistency between belief and behavior creates a motivation for them to engage in behaviors that will minimize the psychological discomfort. Sometimes they will reject something, they'll explain it away, or simply avoid new information. For example, the verse above. Another example is a friend of my wife who held a false but very comfortable belief about General Robert E. Lee, but it was pointed out that he thought that slavery was both a political and moral evil and thus was against slavery, as was General Stonewall Jackson. Well, this went against a narrative that my wife's friend was taught in school. And she said, I got to check into that. She came back. She said, I looked into it. What you said is true. I can't handle that. I like my current beliefs, and then never talked to her again. A good example of cognitive dissonance is knowing that you need more exercise because you sit at a desk all day, but you sit and watch a movie instead, so you have an internal conflict over that. Or you might skip your daily devotions because you took a nap. Perhaps you needed to sleep, or perhaps you were just being mentally lazy. It's an internal conflict, and you have to decide which is which. But cognitive dissonance arises when new information clashes with our identity and belief system. PSYOPs will exploit this by creating small and seemingly harmless concessions in order to shape your identity. Over time, you will unconsciously align your behavior to reduce the internal conflict that's created. And to weaponize this, they will create a false moral dilemma such as good citizens do such and such in order to get you to align with what they want. It's usually subtle. You must quit identifying with your current group and change to align with this other approved group. The COVID-19 scare that coerced people to violate religious and moral beliefs in order to be good people. Oh, don't you want to sign this petition? You should change your profile picture to promote this group. Real patriots buy local. It's all emotional. Emotions are natural and given to us by God. Could you imagine not feeling love for your kids or your grandkids? Why would you take care of them? But psyops will manipulate those emotions. And it's easy to see this in political arenas, but how about the church? Have you ever seen a preacher who appeals to emotions? Don't you want to get saved? It's fire insurance. Jesus and the apostles, while they were emotional people, they appealed to logic and reality. They appealed to reason. Psyops will manipulate narratives in a way that will trigger fear of loss, fear of scarcity, danger, social reaction, anything that will get a knee-jerk reaction in the direction they want. And what that direction is control. Think back to the toilet paper shortages during the government lockdown. During World War II, there were reports of German soldiers who surrendered so they could have decent toilet paper again. They were forced to be soldiers. They didn't really want to be there. They didn't believe in the cause, but they didn't have good toilet paper. They wanted it. It was important. I admit I bought it whenever it was available, not so much out of fear, but out of not wanting to have unnecessary discomfort and knowing that it doesn't go bad. So if I had too much, I could use it later. You see warnings about shortages of pharmaceuticals, clean water, electricity recently in Spain. Matthew 24:6. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. These emotional appeals are given to create a response of fear, but they will also create a fear of ostracism. If you don't comply, you're selfish, and don't you care for people? Oh, you complied. Here's a sticker, and you can use your vaccine passport to go places. When you see and hear these stories, think about them. In 2019, when Mossad first released reports of a virus in Wuhan, China, from which people were dropping dead, the official response was, "That's just a conspiracy theory. You're a fearmonger." Well, a few months later, those same sources demanded compliance against that virus or else, do what they say or else. And if you rejected their demands, you were then guilty of a conspiracy theory. The funny thing about conspiracy theories is how many of them turn out to be reality. A politician will say that if we don't act now, our children will not have a future. Or a preacher screams and yells that if you don't come down right now, it may be too late. And the messages may or may not be true. But the presentation is to create an emotional response. Appeal to the instinct to protect your children and create a sense of urgency. As with the doctrines of demons, if you want to know what's going on, follow the money. It's all about wealth and power and control. Who benefits? Those who serve the false gods benefit. Politicians, pharmaceutical companies, megachurch pastors, the military industrial complex, others. Combination of the above. Who gains? For example, they tell us that the ice caps are melting and our children are going to die, so we need to go green. Well, that sounds great. But who stands to gain? Green energy corporations that get millions of subsidies from the government. Now, there's nothing wrong with governments or with corporations making a profit. That's what they're there for. But when a study is done that benefits the one who's paying for the study, always look at that study with a jaded eye. What's the context of the message that they're giving? If you want to manipulate somebody, you must either have a context that's acceptable or you have to shift the context to one that's acceptable. If you want people to accept extreme behaviors, martial law, surveillance society, these are all things that are normally rejected. But if you want to accept them, you create a context in which these behaviors are acceptable. People will give up liberties for a war, so everything becomes a war. The war on drugs, war on poverty, war on crime. Sometimes you do it for a little time. If the rules and responses seem disproportionate or extreme, look for contradictions in what they're telling you. Watch for what's acceptable or not acceptable to change from what is normal. Now, there's an obscure, what used to be obscure, there's what used to be an obscure political science term called the Overton window. This is named after Joseph Overton. It's simply the political possibility in the window of the range of ideas the public is willing to consider and accept. When the window shifts, then that which was once unacceptable becomes acceptable. But it's always a little bit at a time. You can't get something out on the extreme right off the bat. You have to inch it that direction a little bit at a time. And we see that shift all through society. Some is positive, most of it's not. Those who are in power, and this concept refers to politicians, but it can apply to anybody in power, they can't simply do anything they want. They have to stick to things that are acceptable at the time. They have to stick to things that fall within this window. Those who are in power, they can't shift this window directly, but they can detect where the window is and move as far in one direction in accordance to where it is. However, social movements, lobbyists and think tanks, groups like that, they can shift the window in order to seek what their objectives are. They must convince voters that policies that are outside the window should be in it. That's why we as Christians, if we're faithful, we must be involved in the political realm either directly or indirectly. To paraphrase Calvin Coolidge, if godly men aren't in office, then ungodly men will be. The idea that Christians should avoid politics is a doctrine of demons, and it creates the necessary foundation for the worship of the Baals, the return of the false gods. Would the people accept a surveillance society? Theoretically, no. But we need speed cameras. Oh, security cameras. Oh, gunshot detectors. Things like that. Then when there's a massive cyber attack, you need to accept this mark so that you can be secure and you can work and you can buy and you can sell. What was once unacceptable becomes acceptable, and then it becomes mandatory, or else. So models are necessary to convey information. A model is an abstraction or an interpretation of reality that can be used for prediction and or understanding. They use things like heroes and villains, like portraying one leader as the sole solution to a problem or demonizing deniers as the enemies of civilization. When you hear a story, ask yourself, who are the characters and what roles do they play? Is it something that sounds too simplistic, like good versus evil? Usually these types of models are simply manipulation. And if you're as old as I am, you know that the Russians were always evil. This carried over into Russiagate, but fell flat because the old model no longer worked. In the real world, the good guys are not perfect, and rarely are they fighting pure evil. Spiritually, Satan may represent pure evil, but the good guys, Samson, he was a piece of work. We all know David, a man who was considered after God's own heart, had some pretty serious issues. And Elijah fell short at the end. In the psyops, everything is oversimplified in order to create the emotional response in order to prevent you from looking too closely at the narrative. What are you expected to do or say? What assumptions are being made about you? Advertising, which is a sort of psyops, looks to play upon the values or fears of certain groups and then shape their reality in order to get them to buy their product or service. You see preachers doing that? Politicians? Do you see missing facts or context? Information suppression, misinformation, and disinformation are all tactics. And sometimes, if there's a passage that I don't understand, I'll skip over it for the time being, but I have no problem saying, I don't understand this. Some preachers, however, they will avoid a passage that contradicts a favorite preconceived belief, and they won't tell you that they're skipping it. They won't tell you that it contradicts something that they believe. So, what topics are being avoided, and which critics are being silenced? If somebody needs to be silenced in order to make an idea to be believed, then that idea is not truth. Truth does not need to suppress falsehood. If you see that alternative viewpoints are being silenced instead of confronted, pay attention to what's going on. Do timelines agree? Are critics labeled as conspiracists or kooks? They may be conspiracists or kooks. But if they're silenced instead of having their views confronted, be aware of what's going on. Do the algorithms of search engines suppress certain searches and results? I encountered this earlier today while looking for a specific video to link. I'd even use the exact title of the video and the search would not bring it up. I did have a friend who had the actual link itself, so I was able to get it, and it's one of the ones posted below. But in a corporate, a political, or church scandal, are the critics branded as disgruntled employees with a grudge in order to shift the focus onto their motives instead of where the focus should be? They may be simply disgruntled employees with a grudge, but being labeled that automatically should draw your attention to the need to scrutinize what's going on. If you're not careful, you'll be sucked into the false narrative without even realizing it. Those who use psyops against people will always create a sense of urgency in order to get quick and complete compliance. Many people in sales will create a false sense of urgency in order to sell products. Preachers do that. As both, I will tell you of the sense of urgency or not, as the case may be, because I'm an honest person. But I won't try to coerce you into something simply to get you to purchase a product or just to agree. I don't want you to have a sense of buyer's remorse. And sometimes if you buy my product, it is something that you need now. It is urgent. However, sometimes the immediate is simply convenient. I will tell you that also. It's the same with salvation. If you're not in the family of God, it is an urgent situation. And I would pray that you would accept the Lord Jesus as your Savior right this very minute because you really may not get your next breath. However, I don't want it to be an emotional response out of fear or pressure. I want it to be a rational response. Emotions change easily, rationality doesn't. If you make a rational decision, you can make the conscious decision to live a faithful life. Not perfectly obvious, you're human, but with prayer and meditation upon the things of God, you can be a person after God's own heart. I don't use psyops whenever I teach or when I sell. But those who do will use emotional appeals to group behaviors of false consensus or false fears. When you hear the sense of urgency, slow down and question the need for conformity. Perhaps there really is a sense of urgency, but test the message. You may get a message that says, pass this prayer along right now or you will lose out on a blessing. Delete that message. Adopt this brand, adopt this symbol, adopt this profile picture. It may not be important in and of itself, but it is a foot in the door. Did they come around and tell you that you need to place a certain little rainbow flag on your desk to show support? If you resist, did they try to force you? Oh, you need to do it now before somebody sees that you hate homosexuals. Is there urgency? What's the timing of the message? Why is it happening right now, this very minute? Is it random or is there a bigger story that's being hidden? It may be a real story, but that simply means that you need to be aware of both stories. Don't ignore the more important story. There are a few real coincidences. Is the mainstream media running the headlines about who won the big game while some sort of scandal's erupting? This one doesn't really apply to churches because if there's a big scandal in church, then that is the headline news because that's not covered up. But in the rest of life, be aware of those things. God never expects us to leave our brains at the door. We're expected to use our brains. Be aware of these manipulations. Do you notice certain trends in the news or on TV or advertising? Recognize logical fallacies. If you see a flawed argument as being used to create an emotional response and you recognize it as such, then you cannot be manipulated unwillingly. There are many things to be looking for when somebody or something just doesn't seem quite right. They may use emotions, they may use authorities to give legitimacy to what they're saying, but silence the opposition. They may misrepresent what somebody else said, or they may just try to get you to do it because everybody else is doing it. You may be presented with only two options when there are other valid options. Or they may use generalizations when they should be using specifics. Or they may try to distract from reality using false or irrelevant information. Or they may present false equivalence, which is saying that two unequal things are equal. None of these things prove that something is simply a psyop, except for the lies. But they are things that should grab your attention. You should also look at the backstory of what's being presented. As was mentioned earlier, these tactics can be used in advertising, so even that should not be taken at face value. And truly, most advertisers are simply trying to sell a product. But depending upon who is paying the advertiser, there may be something more sinister underlying the advertising, or the movie, or the TV show. I've already spoken longer than I intended to, and we still haven't gotten to looking at some of the subjects that PSYOPs use, such as predictive programming and negative societal changes, and eventually leading up to the worship of Baal. Next week, we're going to be talking about Captain Crunch cereal, seriously, children's toys and movies, so-called Christian spirituality tools that are marketed, and pop culture in generally that targets those who are not prepared for the assault. They target the mentally helpless and the children. With no foundation in critical thinking, we know that society will be destroyed. But as believers, we're expected to continue the good fight, to spread the word to as many as we can. And it may not seem if this is related to our study that we're working on, but it is. It's central. And I want to close with one last thought here. So Matthew 24:24. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. The elect, not just the called, but those who are called out, are in danger of being deceived. Not every believer is elect. The elect are those who are called out from among the called. They're in danger. If it were not a real danger, then there wouldn't be a warning here. That would be stupid. That would be nonsensical. The grammatical structure implies that the elect will not be deceived, but the verb itself is an infinitive, which implies the potential is there for them to actually be deceived. Then 2 Peter 1:10 says, "Wherefore the rather, brethren, give diligence to make your calling and election sure, for if you do these things, you shall never fall." If you confirm your calling and election, only the called can be called out. This is a compound prepositional phrase. Then you will not fall. This is the Greek me. In English, it's a double negative. In English, a double negative is a positive. But in Greek, this is an emphatic no. You will not fall. Brothers and sisters, that's my prayer for all of us, that we will make our election and calling sure and that we will not fall. Not our common salvation. Our common salvation is based upon nothing but believing in the Lord Jesus, and that salvation is secure, period. This is about election. The false gods will deceive those who can be deceived. But if you're not deceived, you will be attacked and destroyed. Are you prepared for that? Am I prepared for that? I'm praying for all of us.